Hi, everybody, and welcome. I'm Jennifer McGuire. I'm an extension specialist and associate professor in the Department of Family Social Science here at the University of Minnesota on the Twin Cities campus.
And I am Emily Kruckelberg. I work with University of Minnesota Extension as an extension educator in farm safety and health, and I am based out of Rochester.
So we're going to talk a little bit today about ambiguous loss in rural communities and focus on farm stress. So Emily and I come from two different centers in extension. My background is in family, hers is in ag and in support for mental health and well-being in ag and farm families. So we've been working together on a project that kind of combines those two areas, looking at ambiguous loss in farm families. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about how rural communities are specifically stressed and how ambiguous loss is a perspective that can help to move through some of that stress. We're going to focus this specifically with some examples from Emily's own family, which is a farm family, and we'll bring forward a theory developed by Pauline Boss in my home department here in the Twin Cities back in the 1980s and 1990s, and we'll apply some of that to theories of rural development and talk through how that theory can help us move families and communities forward.
Great, thanks for that rundown, Jennifer. So just to get started here, as Jennifer mentioned, I do a lot of work with farmers and in the field of health and wellness, and certainly have an emphasis on farm stress and rural stress as well. Here at Extension, we also have a rural stress task force, and I led that task force for about 1.5 years, and I'm still a member of it. And so we do a lot of work around addressing rural stress, and it started at the very beginning of just understanding rural stress and what that is. So hopefully you can see the slides. I think they're visible. All right, great. I see Jennifer nodding. So this is by no means an exhaustive list, but these are just some things that I pulled in some of the types of stress and stressors that we're seeing in rural communities. And, I think that you'll see a lot of similarities to urban areas as well. And you'll see some unique ones too. So big one, economics. I think that economics are felt on a much more powerful scale in smaller towns. As I think of my hometown, there was only one true restaurant there. And so when it closed, that impacted a lot of things. People weren't staying in the town anymore to eat. They would go to a nearby place. So that's where they were doing their other shopping as well, groceries, etc. So it's a really delicate ecosystem, especially with economics in a lot of these rural communities. Also, rural communities, we see a lot of environment-dependent industries. So think things like tourism around lakes, iron ore mining up north, forestry, agriculture, a lot of these things that are really dependent on what's happening with the weather, with regulations from the government, all of these components. Also, in our rural communities, we just see a lack of resources. There are a lot more resources readily available, especially from a geographic sense in urban areas. So for resources, we're talking things like healthcare, childcare, unemployment resources. Again, that it's either there is not enough to cover the amount of residents that there are in the area, or the closest place may be 2 hours away. I know, and we'll get very quickly into me sharing a little bit more about my family story, but my dad is a patient at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, and so he drives 2 hours to come to his appointments. Because he can only come to Rochester for a lot of his stuff. So it's really one of those things that just adds, stress. It stretches resources because we need to pay those travel costs and all of that. Also, the opioid crisis. We know that this is an issue across the country in urban and rural areas, but Extension has been doing a lot of great work around recovery capital with the opioid crisis in some really rural counties in the state. And so we do know that there it really impacts them heavily due to the lack of resources as well as some other factors. Also, we do see higher suicide rates. The suicide rate in greater Minnesota is greater than that of the 7-county metro. I forget the exact rates, but we are seeing a higher prevalence there of suicide, and especially in farming. That's an area near and dear to my heart, and we have seen an uptick in that as well. Also, job loss in rural areas. So, again, one plant or factory closing, that could have been what employed half of a small community, half of a town. And then suddenly that employer is gone. And so those are things that, again, add more stress to these communities, potentially drive people out of the communities. And then also, speaking of that out migration, we're seeing that from youth and young people, and especially those in LGBTQ community, um, for myriad reasons, but a lot of it has to do with acceptance, and I think the kind of culture that we see in some of our rural communities, again, among other reasons as well. But so thinking about kind of that loss of resources too, just from human capital leaving the communities as well. So there's a lot of things happening in our rural communities in Minnesota. That was what we were kind of hoping to capture with this slide, is that, a lot of people ask me, well, what is rural stress? Well, what does that really mean? What's really happening? And, in communities, it's some of these things, it's all of these things, it's one of these things in a big way. It looks different in every community, but there are also a lot of similarities that we see. And I think, a lot of it relates back to economics and resources, in how these communities are able to be best served. So now we are going to be looking at ambiguous loss today through the lens of a farm family, kind of a typical Minnesota farm family, I would say. And that would be my farm family. So as my background maybe gave it away, I grew up on a dairy farm in South Central Minnesota. And so this is a little bit of my family story that I am going to share with you. So, like I said, grew up on a dairy farm. We were a pretty typical small dairy farm for, the 90s. That's when I was growing up. Um, Milked between 20 and 40 cows, kind of dependent on the year. Yes, this was an old barn. Cool thing about my farm, it was actually founded by my grandmother. And so that's kind of a point of pride for me. So I'm the third generation of a female founded dairy farm, which is pretty cool. And so this, yes, you can see there's the barn, basically where I grew up. So when people ask, were you raised in a barn? I can say yes. And those are my amazing siblings. So yes, there's 5 of us. Again, that's a pretty traditional kind of nuclear family system that we were in. And so yes, 5 of us. Yes, I am the youngest. And yes, I am the tallest. Point of pride, point of contention for my siblings. But so there's all of us. And, growing up, we had to deal with being on the farm. We were expected to be up early. We did chores before we got on the school bus. We were out in the country, so our school bus ride was like an hour every morning. So, we were up maybe 5:30, doing chores, getting ready, go in, get ready for the day, eat breakfast, get on the bus, sit on the bus for an hour, be at school, an hour ride home, and then back to chores, helping with milking, etc. So there was always a lot going on in our family. It was helpful to have a lot of siblings to share the workload with, but a lot of things happening there. And then when I was 11, my parents divorced. And so my sister and I, we moved into town with my mom. But luckily for us, town was just about 3 miles away. And so we were still able to be out on the farm a lot and help on the farm. That was really important thing in our family, to be able to do that. One thing, kind of the key piece, of course, in our farm story is my dad. And I know what you were thinking. I mean, you were probably a little bit taken aback when you first saw this photo. And yes, I get my under eye bags from him. But you may have also noticed that my dad is an above the knee amputee on his right leg. So my dad lost his leg in a farming accident when he was 19. So December 29th, that just passed, that marked 48 years since his accident. So he has lived the majority of his life an amputee. All of us kids have only known him that way. And so that was kind of just a part of life growing up, not something I really noticed. But now that I, am, specializing in farm safety, I really realize the differences that were made and just, some adaptations we had to make to things and capabilities that we had to learn to balance out. If the cows got out, my dad wasn't chasing them. That fell to us to do. And just some of these, different things. Farming is very physical, and my dad did a lot. He does normally wear a prosthesis, and so he wasn't, just out there crutching around. But that impacted how we were able to do our work and the way we approached work and the way we approached how we did things. Like I said, wasn't a huge deal growing up, but we knew how my dad lost his leg, and so there was always this pressure, I guess, to make sure that we were being safe and we're doing that everything that we could. But unfortunately, history repeated itself on October 11th, 2016, at 5:50. No, at 4:54 a.m. It was a Tuesday. I'd gotten a text from my mom saying that my brother Jake, so the one in the middle of that picture of my siblings and I, was in an accident at work. So he works in town. We're from a small community of about 4,000 people. One of the major employers is a cheese plant. So he worked there and then farms with my dad part-time. And he had gotten, what we heard, he got his hand caught in some equipment. So, it was a little jarring, but we thought, oh, it's his hand, it's fine. A few hours later, I got a phone call from my mom, and I just remember picking up my phone. I didn't even say hello. I just picked it up. There was silence, and then my mom just goes, "He lost the arm." And it was a really kind of shocking moment, a really difficult moment. Um, I tell people this, and to this day, I still don't know. It's been over 4 years. I don't know who milks the cows like the week of Jake's accident, because my entire family, both my parents, all my siblings, we were all with Jake. And he had to be airlifted to Hennepin County Medical Center because that was closer than Rochester. It was only an hour versus 2 hours, driving at least. And so it was, kind of this mad scramble. We were all there. I don't know what was happening on the farm at the time. And again, I said, to this day, I still don't. I'm sure I could ask. Somebody must know, because I know the cows got milked by someone. So that was really hard. And it was also really hard to kind of go through that emotional labor of trying to be there for my brother, but also trying to be there for my dad, who was basically re-experiencing his most hellacious day on earth. And so it was a really interesting time in our family. We still are feeling the impact of it, and I think we always will, as we just learn again how to kind of navigate life and how to navigate farming when the two main farmers on our home farm, are both missing limbs. Luckily one's a leg and one's an arm, so they balance each other out a little bit, but it still presents a lot of challenges, and I know is very stressful. And my brother is still adapting to working with a prosthetic, and him and my dad both deal with phantom pain and trying to manage that. And so it's really, it's interesting, and it's really heartbreaking sometimes to just see this hardship that they go through, and knowing that there's not much that we can do. because they want to be independent. They want to be able to do these things. And then the next chapter in my family story, this photo is taken April 2018. This was the last time that I milked cows in the barn with my dad. A few days after this photo was taken, our cows were sold. So we stopped milking cows, and that is a major point in my family's history, like really is going to be a big part, a big chapter of our story at the end of all of it, I think. And so, and I think even you can just see, I have two pictures of my dad up here. The look in his face from the top picture versus the bottom picture. Me smiling, still trying to be the glue that holds it all together. And so that again was a big turning point in just who we were as a farm and as a family. But now today, we still farm. Farming looks a little different. We don't milk cows anymore. My dad is actually retired from farming. He rents our land to my brother. And you can kind of see in his right elbow there, that's his prosthetic arm. You can kind of get a peek at it there. And so Jake, rents the land, runs the farm. My dad helps him. My dad's also a bus driver in town. And he works for my brother-in-law as well, part-time. He owns a monument business. So my dad sets gravestones in cemeteries in the spring and summer as well. And so, a lot of things have happened in our story, and that was just the briefest snippet I could have given you of it. But hopefully that provides some perspective on what at least one family goes through. And, no family story is quite like my family story and vice versa. But there are a lot of similarities, in dealing with injuries and illness on the farm and these different things that come with farming. And again, a lot of this applies to rural communities and rural-based families in general. Again, ours is just in a farming context. So there's a lot of unique stressors that we see in rural Minnesota and again on farms. So these are some specific ones that I pulled from being on the farm. And they kind of broke down nicely into these four major categories. So economics and finance, which I think we hear a lot about in the media, with interest rates, huge debt loads on some of these farms. We know commodity prices have been low, regulations and different things happening with exports and imports on a global level have impacted economics, stateside. Then there's production and environment stressors. So the things that are actually happening on the farm day to day, weather and disaster, barn fires, blizzards. I know when there's these huge snowfalls like the Nor'easter and there are 20 inches of snow on the East Coast. Well, there's a lot of dairy farms in upstate New York. And there are some of them that there was so much snow, they couldn't get their milk picked up. So they need to dump that milk down the drain because they don't have extra storage for it. And so, those things can have really big impacts. Livestock illness, poor crop yields, machinery breakdown, just kind of those typical day-to-day things that can go wrong. Family and relationships, a really, really common stressor. And that's where, Jennifer and I, where our work kind of meshes because farming is still incredibly family oriented. But I'm an animal scientist by training, not a family social scientist. And so, with these family and relationship issues, that can be difficult for people in my position to know how to navigate some of those issues. And so we're looking at things like farm transition. Who's going to take over the farm? Is anyone going to take over the farm? Relationships in general. I know a lot of people that say the good thing about their relationships with their significant others is, we both go to work during the day and we're apart. But when you farm, and of course that might be different right now with working from home, but when you farm, I mean, you are side by side with your family all day long. And so it's like you are really having to navigate business relationships and family relationships with the same people, which can be challenging. And communication is always an issue. To me, communication is the key to good relationships. But we sometimes see a breakdown in those as well. And that adds stress, usually this unseen, unspoken stress. And then lastly, health and wellness. So, long work hours. I know that a lot of farmers and people in agriculture, myself included, really wear that as kind of a badge of honor that, 18-hour days. Yes. But I'm honest enough with myself to know that that still takes its toll. And so it's something that we need to be aware of, and that people are stressed when they don't get enough sleep or eat well. Also, illness and injury. I mean, you saw that firsthand illustrated by my family story. And then barriers to help. So that, again, is access to care. How do we get healthcare and mental health care? And, I'm not going to drive an hour and a half to go to therapy or even to go see my doctor once a year. And so that, again, adds more stress. There are maybe health issues that aren't being taken care of. So you don't feel good. And then that, comes out in different ways of stress too. And it can be really overwhelming. And I actually made a little video to help illustrate this point. We were testing. So, as we just learned, there are a lot of different stressors that specifically our farm families can experience: economic and finance related stressors, production and environmental related stressors, family and relationships, and even health and wellness as well. And as we explore this through the lens of stress and ambiguous loss, we need to think about the overwhelming nature that all of these stressors coming together at once can have. So, for example, from my family story, there were always some economic concerns. Money was tight. Of course, too, we were an older farm and a lot of our equipment was older. So we had to deal with broken tractors quite a bit. Family and relationships. That can be challenging, I think, for any family. And when you have 5 siblings and my parents and other people involved, that was a lot of stress. And then health and wellness also has been a struggle for my family. So we could say that that represents my dad's injury 48 years ago. And then there's my brother's injury from 4 years ago. And then COVID. And all of us are feeling the stress of that, to the point where our family and other families like ours can be right at the tipping point where any more stress can really be the thing that is the overwhelming factor, that we can no longer just sit with our stress and deal with it day to day. We need to actually be confronting it and figuring out how we can address it and help to mitigate some of that. Because, for example, let's say one more time that commodity prices go back down. And now our stress has run over and it gets to be really overwhelming.
So I'm going to move this stress conversation into the concept of family stress. And stress has to do with the individual, but then there's also stress that's at the family level, that's through a whole family. So there's a family stressor, which is a single thing that is a disturbance. So here's a picture of my little Subaru this morning in our 14 below weather, and I'm charging it with a plug-in charger. And this is a stress, right? It's a minor thing. I did manage to get it started just after this. This is the kind of thing that, well, we here in Minnesota, this is just a Tuesday or Thursday, Monday, whatever. And this is a stress, right? It's one of those things that happens. A family crisis is when the stressors build up and it comes to the point where a system is incapacitated. So there was a great article in December's MinPost, and I don't know how many of you see or read that, but it's a great paper that does it's online, it does in-depth reporting that talked about competition from big box. This is the title of it. Big box grocery and rural communities are having to rethink how they do their rural grocery stores. And Small grocers are adapting. Many small grocery stores in rural communities are family owned, have been family owned by for generations, or they move around from family to family, but they're owned within a community. And when the stressors pile up, it can get to the point of a family crisis. Like, do we keep the grocery store? Do we not? And families come to a crisis point around that. So this article does a great job of looking at a family that had to make decisions about whether or not to keep their grocery store and how it impacts not just their family when it comes to crisis level, but all the families around them and the community, whether or not they have a grocery store. And for those of you in rural communities, I'm sure that you have experienced that risk when there's not fresh groceries around. So the next slide moves us into the concept of what is loss and what is ambiguous loss. So again, stress are the things that happen to you, and loss is a way to describe um, where you are after there's been a stressor. So a loss is when something is gone and there's closure. So the factory closes, it's closed. Somebody has died from COVID. You have a death certificate. You know that they're gone and there's closure. It's not coming back. It's not happening again. Ambiguous loss is when you're not sure something is gone for a time. You might have a temporary layoff, there's a furlough, there's reduced hours. Originally, concepts of ambiguous loss were developed to deal with when somebody was missing in action, or somebody was just missing, or when somebody was mentally not present. So somebody was developing dementia or was physically not well anymore. So there is an unclear loss. There's no end in sight. You don't know exactly how it's going to close. And when it's a case like this, it might be unvalidated. Some specific examples that have been happening for us this year is, we have kids home. School is still present, but it's not happening in the same way. Spouses might be sick. There are healthcare costs that are different than there had been. There's a fear of illness. That's a new kind of loss, that time in our brains is being spent being afraid. And there's not a clear validation of what those losses are, the time that's lost thinking about those things, the money that is or isn't lost related to that, the productivity that is or isn't lost, the family relationships that are or aren't lost, um, and the psychological distance that can be created in family relationships. One way to begin to delineate what is a loss versus what is an ambiguous loss is on the next slide when we talk about physical and psychological changes. Can you advance this? So, a physical loss and a psychological loss are two distinct components of loss. A physical loss is when you lose an item or a person or money, and a psychological loss has to do with a relationship or a meaning. So, a loss, a not ambiguous loss, is where you lose a person and a relationship. And so, or you lose both the physical and the psychological aspect of it. So when somebody is dead, they're gone. They're no longer in your life. And even if you still have memories of them, their presence isn't physically or psychologically part of the family because they have passed on. Um, when someone is just missing, they are physically not present with you, but they're psychologically still present. They're still a member of the family because they might be back. You don't know if they're gone. Um, when someone is maybe not fully present because they have dementia, they're still physically present in the home, but psychologically that relationship isn't there. Or when you're not seeing eye to eye with someone, you may physically still be in relationship to them, but you're not connecting anymore because you don't see the same way. And this past year has been a year where many relationships have been strained because people don't see eye to eye on all kinds of things related to economic differences, political differences, healthcare differences, how to manage the pandemic. Um, and so many relationships have been strained related to um, how people are viewing each other and how people view things. And so when there is these two outside boxes, so this physical loss and psychological loss, that's a loss, right? That's not ambiguous. It's validated. You know, you can say, I lost this. This thing ended. My house is gone. My job is gone. A family member is gone. That's a loss. No psychological loss, no physical loss. Well, that's not a loss. So you can say this wasn't lost. When there's a psychological loss, but not a physical loss, this is an ambiguous loss. And when there's a physical loss and no psychological loss, this is also an ambiguous loss. These are two different types of ambiguous loss, but they're both ambiguous losses. And in both of those cases, that loss is sometimes not validated by the people around you, and they can go on for a long time. And so today, what we'll talk about is how those losses can be defined. We're going to talk through some of the losses in Emily's family to sort of organize where they were psychological and physical. And then we'll talk through how to move forward from some of those ambiguous losses. So I'll start here with thinking about Emily, first, what were some of the physical losses that happened in your family? Yes, top right and bottom left are the ambiguous losses, right? The ones where physical and psychological are not in sync. And it's hard to describe how it's a loss because they aren't both the same, right? So Emily, do you want to talk a little bit about what were some of the physical losses in your family?
Yeah, well, I mean, chief among them, body parts.
Body parts, right? For
body
sure.
parts were a major physical loss. Also
Maybe the cows.
Yes, the cows were a big loss. So again, we're still on the farm, we still own the farm, but there's no more cows there, and other critters and that, we had a bit of a menagerie for a while. So those are probably the two biggest ones that come to mind.
What were some of the psychological losses?
I would say, especially with the cows being sold, our family's identity as being dairy farmers. And I will just never forget, about a year after my dad sold the cows, I was talking to him and he was reflecting on it. And he just goes, I don't know who I am anymore because I'm not a dairy farmer. Because, in his mind, like, if you don't have cows, like, you aren't a dairy farmer. Whereas to me, I still call him a dairy farmer. So that was a really, really big one that I know he felt, but I think it was also felt by our family too, of just feeling like we're not dairy farmers anymore.
Right. Who are we? Right.
Yeah.
And I'll say the first time I encountered Emily was when she gave a talk at an extension conference about having been a butterhead, which for those of you from Minnesota know that it's a big deal in Minnesota, the dairy princesses who get their head carved out of butter. And Emily talked about doing that. And so I know that this was a big part of your family identity. And to lose that is tough. And that psychological relationship to animals is huge, huge. And so let's talk about what were some of the ways that these losses were not validated? Like, how did this ambiguous loss get invalidated by the people around you? Not that I'm trying to stir up pain. I just want to.
Right. Yes. No, don't worry. I go to therapy, so we're good. And
I'll just clarify, I am not a therapist. I'm a researcher. So.
But yeah, and so I would say invalidated, as crazy as it sounds, I'll remember pretty vividly, like after my brother's accident, and he lost his arm and people are like, well, at least it was his arm and not his legs.
Yeah.
And, I'm like, okay, well, I also have a dad without legs, so that doesn't help, so just kind of those where I think people in their mind, they're kind of trying to add the silver lining, but they are just doubling down on making me feel like crap. So that was a big one. And I think too, when we sold the cows, people kind of going, well, your dad chose that, which yes, he did. But it was due to, his physical health, as well as, he was losing money on the farm at that point. And so, people kind of going like, well, you can't be sad because you knew this was coming. You chose this, you wanted this.
Right. It's still sad. It's still sad.
Yeah. So those were ways that, again, like you said, Jennifer, kind of invalidated the loss, to be like, oh, I must sound so ungrateful because I still have X, Y, and Z. And yes, my brother is still alive. But yeah, it was certainly really, really tough.
Right. Those are really hard. And I will say I've heard a lot of invalidation of people's losses around COVID in the last year. And I know that some people are losing so much more than others. And so um, it's hard. But I also hear when people say, well, at least they lived. And I think, oh, but they had a really hard time with it. Like it was really painful, or, they still have long-term effects from it. And those losses are really important, even though there still are some silver linings. There are some things that you keep, but the losses really, sometimes those invalidated losses can be even more painful because of the uncertainty to them, because you can't close them and shut them. So how to move forward from an ambiguous loss? There are some really specific steps. So Pauline Boss is the architect of this theory, and writes about it, has a bunch of books, and even a workshop that the University of Minnesota you can sign up and take a class for online. And she's long retired now, but she has this online thing, that workshop that's lives on, that you can do. And so here's one step that we have. Pauline Boss, PaulineBoss. And so she's a professor emeriti in the family social science department. And so this is oh, thank you, Emily. This is a chart from the chapter that Emily and I are finishing up on ambiguous loss in farm families, a rewrite of the chapter that Pauline wrote 15 years ago, I guess. And so starting with what are some things that you're stuck about, and what loss is linked to the stuck feeling? So where's the loss? So first of all, starting, what are the places that you're stuck? So this is one place, is like whether or not you're going to take a job off the farm. And what's lost here? An example is, well, you might lose your cropland rental agreement. If you take another job, you might lose something that you've had, and so you might not be able to get it back later. Um, so let's think about your family, Emily, when you were making decisions about, like, whether to sell the cows, or even after you sold the cows, how to move forward. What were some of the places where you were stuck, and how did you get unstuck and move forward? And your brother and other people in the system.
Yeah, I think the big thing with the sale of the cows especially was just the way that we all played our roles in the farm. You'll hear this phrase from a lot of people, especially those who work in agriculture but are off the farm, being a weekend farmer. So I was a weekend farmer.
Mhm.
So kind of losing those pieces and just figuring out, also, like I said, my brother, the one who lost his arm, he, yes, works full time at the cheese plant, but also, does farm with my dad, farms the land, sells crops, raises some beef cattle out there as well. And so there is certainly, a lot of impact in that. And then two, it's what is my dad going to do?
Mhm.
I'd say he was really the one that was the most stuck. Like I said, the biggest influence was his physical health. Dairy farming, especially in the kind of barn we had, was very physically demanding, very hard on him. He needed to get a hip replacement. And so it was a matter of, kind of him going like, yes, like I'm stuck in that, like, I need to know what my next move is. And then kind of getting out of that was just realizing that, like, you are so much more than just a farmer. And that's something I say to a lot of people once they've exited the business, because they'll go, like, I'm not worth anything else. I can't do anything else. I'm just a farmer. And I won't get too deep into it, but farmers are, caretakers. They are engineers, they are mechanics, they are
Mhm.
accountants, they are economists.
Right.
They actually have a lot of very transferable skills. And
Lots
so
of
my
skills. Yeah.
dad, yeah, so my dad was able to find some work. Then, like I said, driving bus, and then helping my brother-in-law with his business too, which was still, a lot of heavy physical labor, but he was able to take it a little more easy doing that. And so, yeah, those were kind of the keys in recognizing where we were stuck and moving on from them.
One of it is just getting a good inventory of what are the places where you're stuck, and kind of what the things are. And then there are a series of resilient strategies that can kind of move you forward. So first, let's talk about shifting gears. I'll give an example from the grocery store chapter, and then I'll ask you, Emily, what are some ways that your family shifted gears? In the grocery store article, they talk about just shifting the nature of local rural grocery stores, and that for a long time, rural grocery stores were sort of miniature versions of supermarkets. And what happened was gas prices got lower, cars got more efficient, people were going further to town for jobs, and so they weren't shopping at a miniature supermarket anymore, and they were grocery shopping in the bigger cities or in the bigger towns. And so smaller local grocery stores just shifted gears. They started having coffee shops in them. They started having better, more local produce and fresher bakeries so that people would buy things on a daily basis in a store that was closer to their home and come in every day. And just really shifting what they sold so that people would want to shop locally at something that was close to their home. And they would still make their weekly visits to the bigger town to buy the things that they could buy there. And that started to make all the difference for some of these stores. And it's a means shifting the gear. And right, there still are a lot of them closing. I will say this is still an issue. It doesn't solve everything, but the shifting of gears is what they talk about in this article. How did your family shift gears, Emily? I mean, you talked a little bit about it with the job changing,
Mhm.
but how did you?
Right.
What were some examples of shifting gears?
Yeah, I think part of shifting gears for us was being able to kind of refocus some of our energy and our resources. And something that I failed to mention is, I have another brother too, as you saw in that picture, and he also dairy farms. So he runs his own dairy farm about 45 minutes from where our home farm is. And so now it's kind of like, the weekend farmer itch and all those different things, they shift to that. And that is still our connection to dairying specifically. But then also, like I said, our farm is still a functioning farm. We're still growing crops every year, harvesting them, selling them, also using them as livestock feed. I mentioned my brother raises beef cattle, and he's actually been able to expand on that business because more facilities are opened up on the farmstead now.
Mhm.
And, the most recent way that we've shifted gears, thinking about the real modern economic problems that we're seeing, especially economic stress related to COVID-19, is he direct sales all of his beef. So raises
Right.
them and then, sells them by the quarter, by the half. And so it's a really economic way for people like myself and a lot of our family and friends. And also it's, again, allowed us to kind of shift gears and find a way to still have the farm be profitable. Has
Right.
been really key for us.
Right. And I noticed somebody commented being diverse, right? Having a diverse income stream,
Yeah.
spreading out your portfolio. Um, the next question is about perspective taking. What were some ways that you used perspective taking, taking the diverse perspectives of each other or of other members of the community as a way to move forward and move through the loss?
Yeah. With this one, the key was unfortunately, we were not the first dairy farm in our area to sell our cows. And so there was some value in that though, in that we were able to, talk to those other farmers and farm families that had gone through this. And a lot of them actually were still farming too. And so I think that helped us, with the shifting gears piece too, is doing some of this perspective taking and seeing how other people who had experienced this had moved on from it and reacted to it and so I think that there was a lot of value in being able to do that. And then also, from the standpoint of me and my siblings, I think we were really like, no, dad, just keep milking, we'll figure it out. But then being able for us to put ourselves in his perspective and just now knowing that it's like he gets so much more sleep and he's not breaking down his body every day. So there are some good things in being able to see it from other people's point of view.
Yeah. Okay. The next one is meaning making. I'm going to do two now together, meaning making and considering the power dynamics. So we'll ask those as two questions. Meaning making is where you kind of create a narrative, and I can see that you did that in your first section, and things take on a symbolic meaning, and then thinking through the power dynamics of how things have done. You want to talk a little bit about those two? I'm just being mindful of the time, so we have a little question and
Yes.
answer time at the end.
Yeah. Jennifer and I get very carried away. We really care about this topic, if you can tell. Yeah, meaning making. I think that I can only speak for me, but for me, the meaning making has really been this. I am so like, I'm going to get really cheesy here for a second, but I am so blessed that I get to do what I do every day for my job. And a huge part of that is being able to share my family's story. And for me, that has really helped me, make meaning out of everything that we've done. Like, yes, we have been through the ringer, but all of these things have helped build our resilience and helped make us advocates for these topics, which, I think people see it the most broadly in my family from me since it's my job, but all my family, they are sharing these messages and telling their stories. And my dad, he is always willing to go and speak to groups of farm kids and farmers in general about his experience and farming his entire life as an amputee. And so that has really helped us make a lot of meaning out of this, is by treating it as a story, as a narrative, as you said, Jennifer. And my entire family, were very passionate about education. And I believe really firmly that storytelling is the most powerful form of education. And so that's for us really been helpful in kind of our healing from the loss and moving on from it. And then power dynamics, the big thing that sticks out to me is my brother, renting the home farm now from my dad and running it. And so kind of the shift in that, my brother kind of was working for my dad, and now my dad's more working for my brother, and my brother makes the decisions and does all of that and makes the calls and gets to tell my dad what to do. And so that I know that there is sometimes tension there. But I also know that it's, certainly something that we have all taken in stride and are still figuring out. It's only been 3 years. But yeah.
Great. Let's open the next two up. Recognizing what's not lost and why, which is thinking about the strengths that you had as a family. And the last one is how you share information inside and outside the family about what's happened.
Yeah. So, I mean, for us, it was really clear, what wasn't lost. And that was that we still had the physical farm, which is really important. That legacy piece, we don't have time to get into it, but if you want to learn more, Google agrarian imperative.
Uh-huh.
But that legacy piece was really important, that we still have that. And we still have that identity as dairy farmers.
And you still have your family.
Yes, and we still have each other. And it's been that, yes, things have been lost, but you kind of figure out like the real things that actually matter, and how they're not necessarily gone. Yeah.
And then how have you shared information inside and outside the family?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a matter of, as things were happening, it was, we're kind of a phone tree. Like, if I need my dad to know something, I can just tell my brother and he'll know it. And so, sharing it just throughout in that very open dialogue in our family. We have the group text, all of that. And then just sharing it with other people. I think for us, a really big key was being respectful of everybody sharing it in the way they saw fit. I'm a social media person and I like to take pictures. And so I was able to post some things on that and share my thoughts on, our family selling the cows. And that was what worked for me. And that was a really good way to share that information. for, especially my family members that are maybe a little more on the quiet side. So yeah, that was kind of the key there, is just knowing maybe who the main sharers of information are going to be as far as, outward goes, and, making that work, and me letting them know, hey, I shared this, or hey, I'm saying this, and making sure we're all on the same page with it.
Right. And that can really help to level those power dynamics, to share a lot of information. Obviously, children, you can't share everything with children when they're young, and there may be people, you can't share things with, but the more information you can share, the easier it makes to move things forward for a family.
We do
We do
have
have
a
about
rule stress webpage on our website. So if you
good
go
call.
to extension.umn.edu, and then if you just search rural stress, you should be able to find that page where there's a lot of resources and information as well. And then when this chapter is done, we'll have some more information up there as well. And
Right.
be sure to reach out to us. I know
Right.
Jennifer and I are both more than happy to hear from any of you. If you
We'd love
have
to. Yeah.
more in-depth questions or anything that we can do, we'd love to hear from you.
Right. Or other ideas for follow-ups on this topic that the two of us could do together. So we'd love to hear from you. Thank you.